Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the AB8 webinar. I'm Lun So with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. And presenting today, we have Andrew Martinez, engineer at the California Air Resources Board. We also have Bill Elrick, executive director of the California Fuel Cell Partnership. All right, before we begin, just a few administrative items to talk about. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the webinar to all registrants, and also the presentation will be made available. Also, we'll be collecting the questions and answers, and that will be emailed out in a blog to all registrants. The presentations will also be made available on the California Fuel Cell Partnership website at CAFCP.org/resources. And also, everyone is currently on mute. We encourage you to ask a question through the GoToWebinar Ask a Question feature. All right, and with that, hand over to Andrew.
Thank you, Lynn. Today we will be covering the 2018 annual evaluation of fuel cell electric vehicle deployment and hydrogen fuel station network development. This is an annual report that the California Air Resources Board puts out to help inform the California Energy Commission's decisions on new funding for hydrogen fueling infrastructure, but we also do, of course, provide this as a public document so that public and industry at large can benefit from the analyses and the findings that we have made in the past year. Okay, there we go. So for those who may not be familiar, an overview of Assembly Bill 8 was signed by Governor Brown in 2013. It extended the previous AB 118 and allocates up to $20 million annually for hydrogen infrastructure investment through the Energy Commission through the end of 2023, beginning of 2024. As part of AB 8's requirements, CARB annually reports to the Energy Commission on the current and projected fuel cell electric vehicle fleet and station progress, an assessment of the coverage and the need for new coverage and new capacity provided by future investment of stations, recommended placement for new stations, recommended funding level up to the $20 million annual allocation, and recommended station technical specifications such as the standards for fueling protocol, the period at which hydrogen quality should be evaluated, et cetera. This is the fifth such evaluation. Our first was in 2014. Each year, the evaluations do provide findings that directly address these concerns, but we also do report on special topics and observations that we've made over the previous year, and so we will again discuss some of those today. As background, zero-emission vehicles have been found by CARB multiple times through many studies, many analyses, to be vital to addressing our air quality and climate change goals. This is both for today's communities and population and the population for tomorrow. We have very aggressive goals, especially for GHG reductions by 2050, and so zero-emission vehicles are a key part of our mobile source strategy to be able to achieve the reductions we need throughout the state. Part of AB8's efforts are to enable industry to scale up to a self-sustained market. So the AB8 funding is designed in such a way that we can maximize it so that we can help industry get started, get the first hydrogen station network developed, and assess whether or not or the timing of an appropriate off-ramp for government funding so that eventually this is a fully self-sustained, successful commercial and industrial venture in California. As part of the effort, and a fundamental principle of this program is that hydrogen fueling stations really are needed ahead of fuel cell vehicles to enable the market launch. And so that was a fundamental principle adopted by the passage of AB8. The stations will come first, and that will enable vehicles to be deployed. And we have been seeing that actually in action, and as is reported actually through our December joint agency staff reports that are released by the California Energy Commission, and show that we are increasing our utilization at these stations at the same time that we're actually increasing the total capacity of our network. This year, there were two very large and significant influences on our analysis and on the perspectives that we communicate through the report. The first is Executive Order B4818, which was signed early in January of 2018. It is Governor Brown's new goals or additional goals for zero-emission vehicle infrastructure and zero-emission vehicle deployment. And it states a target for state agencies to work toward 200 stations by 2025. This is only 2 more years after the essentially the funds for AB8 are allotted. So somehow we have to get from 100 stations to 200 stations by 2025 with a current target of 100 by 2023. So that presents a significant challenge that requires a lot of analysis and thought about how are we actually going to make that happen. There are similar targets for plug-in vehicle charging. And in addition, there's a target of 5 million total ZEVs in California by 2030. This is in line with the mobile source strategy that CARB has published previously. In addition, there's a directive to expand infrastructure through the low carbon fuel standard. And for those who have been following the proposed regulation changes in that process over the past year, you'll recognize that that is actually right now in some of the proposed changes that would be pending board approval at a future board meeting date. The second major influence this year was the California Fuel Cell Revolution, which was actually published by the California Fuel Cell Partnership. It represents a high degree and a lot of effort of public-private cooperation and the development of a shared vision for 2030. We have Bill Elric here from the California Fuel Cell Partnership, the executive director. I don't want to steal his thunder, so I'm going to stop talking about that and let him talk about it and present some of the key messages from that document.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to share the Fuel Cell Partnership's 2030 vision during this presentation. And I viewed the two documents really as companion pieces. Your work on the progress and needs around the AB8 legislation, not to mention the incredible analysis we'll hear more about today, and our work with you and others on setting the vision we're all striving for. So I wish to present a very high-level overview of our document, the California Fuel Cell Revolution. As we have now successfully proven the technology and launched the market, albeit at the very initial steps of commercialization, we're already looking towards the future and our ultimate goals. That goal, where hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles are the norm and contributing to society environmentally and economically, require everyday customers both able and willing to purchase these vehicles. We know they are already cleaner than the traditional vehicles, but we have much more to do to attract the majority of new and used car buyers, and because they will ultimately drive this revolution in commercialization. In this image, we see the evolution of customer adoption. Today, the first adopters are willing to accept the developing market, where not all of the elements are equal or better than the traditional options. This includes the early stations and fuel costs, which do need to come down, and the network of stations, which are still building out. To move from the early adopters seen on the left to the right side, where the majority of customers are purchasing these vehicles, we need the vehicles, stations, fuel, and entire network to be equal or better than today's option. Our document lays out those strategies to get there. I understand there is a lot going on in this graphic, so let me step through it. On the left is our mission, and that's accelerating commercialization. By scaling up the production of vehicles, fuel, and the station network, we'll create the environment where the value proposition is evident to the consumer, and they're willing and able to start adopting the technology in greater numbers. As they do this, we will achieve the environmental, economic, and society goals on the right side of the document, or on the graphic. Our strategies are presented in the wedges on the top of this pie, where we seek to enable the market through market policies and private investment, establish it by increasing and building the consumer demand, and then expanding this market to leverage other opportunities and spreading the technology to other transportation applications and other energy systems. Succeeding at these strategies will create the opportunities along the bottom of the pie, which start off as challenges, but then become our opportunities and strengths. These include increased private investment, cost effectiveness, renewable fuel production, and consumer adoption. This creates a sustainable market that is led by industry and customers and gives government a clear off-ramp. Along the bottom of this graphic, you'll find some of the milestones we'll be targeting along the way. So I would like to end by answering the question posed earlier this week on a webinar we held, which was, how can we help the revolution? I ask that you start by talking to your car dealers and fuel providers about the technology. What are they doing to provide you this opportunity? Talk with your local officials and ask for their support in adopting all ZEV technologies. And finally, engage your family, friends, and neighbors. Help us spread the awareness so that we're all working towards commercialization and achieving California's goals and opportunities together. So I hope this helps set some of this up a little bit. And again, thank you, Andrew, for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Bill. I want to just remind everybody, because we are getting some questions, please do continue to have those questions rolling in, but just a reminder that we will be answering questions, as many as we can, at the end of the webinar. So again, thank you, Bill, for providing that overview of the California fuel cell revolution. And so now, with that in mind, with the governor's executive order in mind, want to move into the findings and some of the lessons we've learned and what we've determined from this past year's development and some analysis for the future projection of vehicles and stations within the state. So California's fueling network, and I will remind everybody that California's light-duty vehicle retail fueling network continues to mature within the state. We previously reported we do, of course, have the ability to drive from northern Southern California to Southern California, thanks to the station at Coalinga that bridges that gap. Drivers are able, of fuel cell vehicles, are able to go out to Truckee and to Lake Tahoe, able to go to Santa Barbara, able to drive as far, essentially, as from Lake Tahoe region all the way down to San Diego. There are important sub-networks and clusters of stations developing in high market potential areas like West LA and along Santa Monica Boulevard, down the 405, all the way ringing around the Bay Area. And we anticipate continued development of even more stations throughout the state. This figure is showing 36 total stations. I will say, as we reported in our document, there is a caveat. There are actually only 35 right now. At the time we were finishing the report, we were expecting one more station to be open by the time we actually were done with printing, but we are still waiting on that one station. So 35 right now, 36 imminently. One thing I do want to emphasize, all of these numbers are open retail stations. And as I go through the numbers going forward, I will only be reporting based on open retail stations and their open date. This is a departure from the past where we've had several stations that actually were still from earlier research and development kind of funding, stations that were really, to be honest, not originally intended to be an open retail station like we know today. They were to be demonstration types of stations. All those stations now have either, a couple of them have closed, but actually the majority of them have either finished their upgrade to retail capabilities, or they are in the process of doing that. So we have shifted all of our analysis only to an open retail basis for all of our counts and tracking. And on this slide, you can see, again, all those open retail stations. If you compare it to previous years, these numbers are lower for previous year's reports. The numbers are lower than in the early years because of that shift, because we used to count non-retail as well on different dates. So we expect all 64 of our funded stations to be open by 2020. The majority of them by 2019. There's just some uncertainty on a couple of stations pushing them out to 2020. By the end of 2018, there could be as many as 40 open retail stations throughout the state. And one thing I do want to mention is that we have a very positive indication about the financial viability. Now, granted, this doesn't say that anywhere near that the station network or the industry is fully self-sufficient, and we don't know how many times this could be replicated today. But the Newport Beach station was upgraded this year to full retail, and that was fully self-funded by the operators of that station. It was not funded, did not receive grant funding for that upgrade. Our second finding essentially compares the progress of the station deployment to what we had expected about the same time last year. And so our station deployment in the past year has remained almost completely on schedule. Again, in this figure, you'll notice that the 2018 analysis is lower in early years, but that's because of the difference in the basis for restricting only to open retail stations in our analysis this year. And what we found is that basically any stations that we thought would be open by the end of last year, but were not, were actually only delayed by less than 6 months. this is a marked departure from the past, and it really actually speaks to two things. It speaks to improved communication and understanding between public and private partners through this effort, and it also actually does seem to indicate improved understanding and a lot more, a greater effectiveness of the station developers at being able to navigate some of the early station development processes a lot faster than in the earlier station development. So as they're getting more experience, they're leveraging that experience and being able to bring stations online faster. Our next finding concerns the vehicles themselves and the vehicles that have been registered and released to date, and the auto manufacturer projections for future releases. So the future releases do seem to have recovered substantially from what we reported last year. For those who may not be familiar, part of the ABA process is that CARB distributes a survey to all the auto manufacturers. They are required to provide a number of vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, and preferably an idea of where they think those vehicles are going to be deployed for the next 3 model years. They're also asked to optionally provide similar projections for the 3 model years after that. So we have up to 6 years of future data from the auto manufacturer survey. So I will step through this figure, which actually shows all of the data that we've collected to date through all of the annual surveys, which gives you a sense of the range of uncertainty over the many years and the reactions to station development progress over the years in the past 5 years. So this blue area are the mandatory periods, and the orange area are the optional periods estimates. The diamonds are the end of any period. So for 2018, it's 3 years in the future and 6 years in the future. So our new estimate is 23,600 vehicles in 2021, 47,200 in 2024. We have seen growth over this past year. We had 2,800 fuel cell vehicles registered, more fuel cell vehicles registered as of April of this year compared to April of last year. That's 175 nearly % year-on-year growth. We are seeing, again, our near-term or our mandatory period projections increasing quite substantially compared to what we reported last year. You can see that last year we kind of had a lag in the near term, or a standstill in near term, and up to 2-year delay in the long term. We now are reporting our highest projections for the long term that we have reported ever. I will mention that this is not the fastest total or the fastest acceleration deployment rate that we've seen, but it is a recovery from what we had seen last year, where we actually had our long-term projections fall. We do posit in the discussion of the report that last year we had low numbers because the survey was with the auto manufacturers at the same time that announcements were made regarding stop work orders on a number of stations that were in development. So we cannot prove this. We do not have conclusive evidence for this, but we think that what we're seeing here is there was a bit of a reaction in the survey responses to some to the development progress last year, and now with additional vision towards the future, auto manufacturers are regaining their confidence in their ability to deploy vehicles in the future. I do also want to highlight this 23,600. Internally and externally, we've gotten some questions about whether or not the auto manufacturer surveys are perhaps somewhat intentionally providing low estimates in the near term and high estimates in the long term. And this, again, is not conclusive, but I think this is a good sign that we're not really seeing any gaming of the survey in that regard. We actually have for the first time a mandatory period estimate that's within the range of all the optional period estimates for that same year that we've had in the past. So I think this is a significant sign that we are not having survey responses gamed in terms of trying to just backload the responses. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, CARB is responsible for providing recommendations of areas where new hydrogen fueling stations need to be placed. And so in support of the development of, Executive Order B4818 and the development of the California Fuel Cell Partnership vision and the fuel cell revolution, CARB leveraged our CHIT tool, the California Hydrogen Infrastructure tool, which we've used in the past in an iterative manner in station selection and awards and solicitations to essentially automate what that process might be in the future if we just essentially looked at placing stations iteratively in the most highest potential area, and then accounting for what the network looks like and changes in the network and how it's meeting the needs after each station is placed. And so we did a lot of work to develop this, and what we came down to is the conclusion that, through public-private cooperation, we developed this heat map, which really shows where the concentration of 200 hydrogen stations might be by 2025 compared to the 64 open and 35 open and 64 funded that we have today. And we can use all that whole process and all that data. There's a lot of data that is really underlying how we ended up at this heat map to help inform where the Energy Commission's next station funding program should be. In addition, that analysis showed that a path to 2025 and the 2030 goals really satisfies the market needs because it is following how the market is at least modeled or expected to develop, but also ensures equitable benefits from the hydrogen fueling network. So in today's hydrogen fueling network, the CHIT tool and CARB analyses basically assume that coverage is provided by a station out to a 15-minute extent of drive time. And what we see is that with the 64 funded stations, we can essentially provide coverage or provide fueling opportunity, a base level of fueling opportunity to about a third, slightly over a third of all disadvantaged communities. It's pretty good, but as we look towards the scenario development, and a scenario that I'm going to emphasize does not explicitly try to follow or try to meet DACs, it's actually following the market and following an expanding market. We actually can, with 1,000 stations, the goals of the fuel cell revolution, pretty much provide base fueling coverage for nearly all populations, all parts of the populations of all disadvantaged communities. And so with 97% here, we provide coverage to 94% of California's total population with these 1,000 stations. And this is important to CARB and to many of the state entities to ensure that we are equitably distributing the benefits of these technologies that are really meant to help improve public health and help fight climate change. With the type of scenario that we're looking at that requires meeting the goals of AB8 by 2023 and the goals of Governor Brown's executive order by 2025, it is possible to meet the projected fuel cell vehicle fueling capacity needs through 2025. So if we meet the goals that are laid out before us by the governor, we'll definitely be able to provide enough fuel for those 47,000 vehicles that I mentioned by 2024. So in this figure, the more solid colors are the funded station capacity, and these lighter colors are the additional station capacity that is projected through our simulation. I will say that our simulation is built on station capacity growing through time, or average station capacity is growing through time, but it is done so on a schedule that is reasonable and within the bounds of what we're hearing from industry through many of our discussions, including the discussions that led to the development of the fuel cell revolution. So in this figure, we look at that balance between the demand of those 47,000 vehicles or the 26,000 vehicles in 2021 and the station capacity that we will have. So in 2021 and in 2021 and 2024, if we do not fund any more stations, if we stick with only the 64 stations, we're really going to be in trouble. We need to continue on the path of funding more stations right now. It's not looking like ABA can stop. However, if we do include the projected stations that we are looking at in this scenario to meeting Governor Brown's executive order, we can provide enough fueling opportunity throughout the state. I will emphasize, this is the capacity of throughput at stations. This is not the capacity of production of hydrogen, which is a separate issue and definitely an acknowledged issue in California right now. On the left, that capacity is not distributed geographically, but on the right, it is distributed according to the scenario that we assessed, and we see that essentially we can meet capacity needs in every county, essentially, This one tiny sliver for Orange County in 2024 is on the order of a couple of stations, so it's not really a significant issue. It can be met very easily, especially given the uncertainty of development out on such a long timeline. This is not an actually significant result. And so since we do have sufficient capacity, what we are seeing is that achieving the goals of EOB 4818 actually enables 2 to 3 times greater fuel cell vehicle deployment than currently planned, according to the auto manufacturer survey. So if in 2024, we're only showing the 2024 here because this is the furthest point we have for vehicle numbers. Here's where the 47,000 vehicles are. This range in purple is how many vehicles can be fueled by 150 or about stations on that path to meeting the governor's executive order. And so you can see that there's quite a large gap here. So, you know, AB8 was built on the principle that we need to bring out stations before vehicles, and we're doing that today. Meeting the governor's executive order, perhaps to an even greater degree, ensures that opportunity for fuel cell vehicles to be confidently deployed on the road. In California, for those who may not be familiar, adopters of fuel cell vehicles and also plug-in vehicles are eligible to receive a cash rebate through the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project. Those who do receive a cash rebate are invited to participate in an optional survey or surveys. On the plug-in vehicle side, there are multiple at this time, but on the fuel cell side, there's just the adoption survey. So this survey asks respondents about their influences and their decision-making process when they chose the vehicle. It asks questions about what kinds of stations were important to you, what station locations were important to you to be able to purchase this vehicle. It asks them about their early fueling experiences. Where do you fuel most often right now? How far do you have to travel? What kind of where do you need a new station the most? And we utilize these data to really validate a lot of the fundamental principles and assumptions and methods that are built into our California hydrogen infrastructure tool, that are built into the geospatial analysis that we perform. Because in that tool, we make a very fundamental assumption that stations need to be near the homes of the likely adopters first, and then maybe, and then to a slightly lesser degree along their commute. And being able to figure that out and where that needs, what that means in terms of station location on a map, that's what the tool is designed to do. And we're finding through the CVRP that, you know, that actually is a defensible position. That is a defensible assumption. We're finding that for these early adopters, the station near home was clearly the most important in their purchase decision, that stations along their commute, existing along their commute, were a notable second, but they definitely stand out from any other type of location. And then when we look at how they're actually using the network, it seems to actually line up as well in the same kind of manner. If we have time, I do plan on discussing some deeper geospatial analysis that we performed on these data. In addition, we do assess how well the fueling network is actually meeting the requirements of Senate Bill 1505, which requires that all hydrogen sold through the state and receives grant funding must have 1/3 of its energy be renewably sourced in the production process. In addition, after 3.5 million kilograms are sold in any given year of hydrogen, so after 3.5 million kilograms are sold in any given year, then excuse me, that requirement is also applied to totally privately funded stations. And so if we do assume that any future solicitation will only be met by the minimum requirement, we will be at 34% by 2024. But also our current network as funded when totally built out will actually also exceed the requirement by a few percentage points more at 38%, according to the solicitation documents and what we know about the operating network. Importantly, we actually are projecting that sometime in 2019, we could cross that threshold. So there's not very much time left before even a fully privately funded station will be required to dispense hydrogen that's produced with 33% renewable energy. That's tomorrow, basically, on the timescale of what we're talking about for this network development. So it's important to keep track of this. Our next finding is that achieving the 2025 goals, and I believe this might be our final finding, achieving the 2025 goals of the executive order actually enables California. It really sets us up really nicely to achieve the partnership goals for 2030, and it does actually require accelerated investment. So here again, this is the heat map of the 200 stations by 2025. These are actually the dots, the points that were selected through our tool. I will emphasize that this is a scenario analysis tool. CARB does not intend for these points to mean that this is the only place that is acceptable for a station. It's not meant to be that precise on the actual coordinates of these points. These are essentially notional, but we did need to place them in order to understand how the network might grow out in time. The sizes of the dots are related to the capacity of the stations, and you can see that by 2025, we're looking at the maximum size being about 900 kilograms per day, and then the color coding provides the year in which we think that that station would be deployed. And so if we move on to 2030, obviously you won't be able to see all 1,000 stations at this scale, but you can see how we're clustering stations, but we're also into high market areas, but we're also moving the network into a lot more connector type stations. We're moving the network into the second markets that would follow on after the core markets are activated. You can kind of think of this as the network itself kind of branching out from its heart into kind of through all the other veins that are connected to it. We see areas like Fresno really getting built up, the Sacramento region. We start seeing connectors importantly into interstate travel, which is going to be very important for ensuring a fully successful network and a fully successful market, especially by this time frame. And so really meeting 2025 really kind of helps us. You can see the parallels between these two networks. And I do not include it in this presentation, but if you had attended the partnership's presentation on their California Fuel Cell Revolution, one of the very interesting things about this, oh, actually, I think I do include it here. Yes, I do. One of the very interesting things about this 1,000 station network is that it is very similar to the 8,000 gasoline stations in California. I will clarify, this 8,000 gasoline stations is a subset. There are about approximately 10,000. These are 8,000 that have sold fuel sometime within the last 3 years and are also light duty centric retail station. Some of those 10,000 include truck stops and marine fueling, et cetera. So those are not included in these 8,000. And we can see that this projected network very similarly follows the development patterns here. As I mentioned, part of the finding says that we need accelerated funding. These blue diamonds essentially lay out what the number of vehicles could be deployed, assuming business as usual funding continues all the way out into the future into 2030. This is importantly business as usual, continuing something like $20 million per year. This purple area, shaded area, is the number of vehicles that would be supported by the plans of the California Fuel Cell Partnership and the executive order, and these dots are the correlating numbers of stations. And you can see that clearly an acceleration in investment. This could be public in the near term, could be public and private. Eventually, we're looking towards an off-ramp, as Bill mentioned, for public funding into private funding. But clearly, business as usual will not get us to where we are looking to go. I think I'm going to pause here and take some questions related to these first two main portions of the webinar, and then if we have time, I'll discuss some of the more technical aspects of that 2030 analysis and some geospatial analysis related to the CVRP. So I think, are you guys reading this?
I'll read
Okay.
some questions for you and cue you up. Let's see, I see a few here on renewable electricity. So wondering if you can break down some of the sources of renewable hydrogen and what technologies are in place, as well as, sorry, there was a second one there that's closed. Is there analysis on the hydrogen creation in terms of being produced? Oh, that's something different. So yeah, if you can talk a little bit about renewables, what's in place, what's being used.
Right. So today, in today's network, there are probably two main sources of renewable energy for hydrogen. One of those is renewable biogas, or renewable natural gas. So the conventional means of generating hydrogen is to use a steam methane reformer device on natural gas. So that will split natural gas into hydrogen and some CO2. Even through that process, a fuel cell vehicle provides about a 50% reduction in CO2 compared to an ICE vehicle. You can perform that same process through renewably produced natural gas from a variety of sources. That's actually one of the strengths of hydrogen, is that you can produce that natural gas, for example, from dairy digesters. You could, or a similar stream you could produce from dairy digesters, from anaerobic digesters in municipal waste plants. You could produce it from many different sources, from algae even. So there are technologies out there, some further in the future, some closer in actually being implemented right now. The other is through electrolysis or renewable electricity. So you can use renewable electricity, you pass it through an electrolyzer, which actually is in some ways or many ways essentially a fuel cell in reverse, and you split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And so that process provides zero emissions as long as that electricity comes from a renewable source like wind or solar. And that also counts in our programs right now.
So a related question is, why not just use that renewable electricity in battery vehicles instead of converting it to hydrogen and using it in fuel cells?
So, right. So we often get this question, and it tends to come down to this question of would the state pursue two technologies? And I think that this question of round trip efficiency really forgets a lot of the more basic and fundamental issues. The state has very aggressive goals for GHG reductions and criteria pollutant emission reductions. Those goals essentially require a full turnover of the fleet to ZEV vehicles. We know that some people, of course, in California adopt battery electric vehicles, and that for a lot of people, it actually works and it fits for their lives. But you have to look at the full spectrum of vehicles that are out there in the market right now. People have various uses for all their vehicles. They use them in different ways, and they have all different types of vehicles. And it has not become yet abundantly clear that battery vehicles will be able to meet all those uses. Fuel cells are a lot more adept at scaling up to larger vehicles, scaling up to vehicles that need to have higher towing performance, for example. And so in order to get to everybody, we also have people who live in multi-unit dwellings, and it's a question of how likely is it that they will be able to actually have charging at home, people who live in big apartment buildings. And for them, it might actually be better to have a fuel cell vehicle where you can just go to a station, just like you do with a gasoline station, right? To have that central fueling facility. So to reach everybody, we see that we're really going to need both technologies to achieve our goals. In addition, hydrogen, we're looking at hydrogen also on the scale of the major or larger energy transitions, even in interacting with the grid and being able to act as an energy storage, and being able to then actually get more renewable energy onto the grid because you're able to have a sink for excess renewable electricity when you don't have the demand otherwise. So there are numerous positives to looking at hydrogen. Is not only the round trip efficiency that matters for this technology or for our future, really.
Yeah, and if I can just kind of build on that, one of the things in the Fuel Cell Partnerships Revolution document that really came out was the synergies and connectivities between both electricity and hydrogen as energy carriers, and how not just transportation, but across that energy system, as you mentioned, we really need both because they're complementary, they do different things well, and they have challenges in different ways. And together, we're going to need both, not just for transportation, but for all of our recently expanded renewable goals. It's going to be very important. So thank you. Next, let's talk about locations. Who decides where the next stations are going and being built? Let's talk about that process a little bit.
So that is really more of a collaborative process, I would say. The way that it happened so far is that the Energy Commission manages solicitations, requests for applications for funding stations. The applicants themselves are asked, or are really required, to provide their description, their analysis of the market viability of that location. That market viability can be informed by their own analyses, their own traffic studies. That can also be informed by their collaboration or discussions with auto manufacturers to understand where auto manufacturers think their vehicles are going to be able to go. It can actually be informed by if they are able to come to some agreement with a local fleet that would use the station. That could be add to the market viability argument. In addition, as I mentioned, ARB does provide recommendations for where we think stations need to go, and that is informed by our geospatial analysis tool that looks at a number of market indicators for or demographic indicators to try to assess where is the likely adopter market going to be. We do take in demographic indicators, we take in the actual DMV registrations, and we do actually implement the results from the auto manufacturer survey that we get each year. So we kind of balance all those things against each other, weigh them against each other, and come up with our recommendations. What we also do is, because this is essentially a process that's iterative 1 year to the next, and also within each solicitation iterative from one station award to the next, or it has been in the past at least, the tool is actually able to look at where is the market, and then for all the funded stations, how does the coverage and capacity they provide to that market match up? Where are the places where those are most out of sync? And that becomes a higher recommendation for a new station. And so as each station is awarded or new stations are added to the network, that has an impact on the overall evaluation throughout the state.
Good, good. I think you covered, there was another question here about how CHIT is used regarding local capacity needs or the coverage gap. And I think what I heard you maybe already answered this was it's a iterative process that provides guidance and good stewards of the money on the public side, and input by the actual proposals by the industry side together, and we're always learning there.
Right. And I will emphasize that the tool is not designed to be a tool that says the station needs to be on this corner at this address. The tool is designed to give more of an area-based analysis, kind of looking for hotspots.
Okay, let's talk a little about hydrogen price, and let me make sure I combine a few here. There's some questions about today's price as compared to gasoline and vehicle efficiency, and what that really means, the cost per mile, I'll interpret that as. And then as we look at the future prices going out to 2030 and beyond, a question about what might the predicted prices be, if you know, and what advancements or progress needs to be made along those ways.
So right now, the prices that I think reported in our latest joint agency staff report are somewhere around $15 to $16 per kilogram on average, accounting for the more than double efficiency, or more than 2 times the efficiency of a fuel cell versus a gasoline vehicle, and the relative energy content of a kilogram of gasoline and a kilogram of hydrogen and a gallon of gasoline. You're looking at hydrogen costs probably somewhere around 2.5 times what gasoline does currently. That, however, is acknowledged as this is not where the market really needs to be. We know that. It is that expensive because partially because, or in a large part because, it is still a small market. This industry of hydrogen as fuel for light duty vehicles has not reached scale yet. We're still just in the early commercial stages. Our understanding is that as we get to scale and as we are able to leverage improvements and efficiency of distributing hydrogen, producing hydrogen, all those logistics, the costs can come down, and they can come down significantly. Bill probably is better to discuss the 2030 goals and how price is built into there. But so
yeah, sure, I'll comment on that. And one is we're still learning and discovering how and where the prices can come down. I know in our analysis, we've already seen, Shell has put out some information that 30 plus stations a year order, and I think that was for globally, but I have to go back and check, but those could cut costs of stations maybe by half. And so that's not too far away. And if we can cut stations in cost in half, then we're going to see a resulting fuel price drop of some sort. It may not be 1-to-1. So that really impresses us on what scale is. The other, as Andrew pointed out, and we have in our document, when we start to see the other uses of hydrogen, when excess renewable hydrogen has a revenue stream instead of being curtailed like it is today, or the utilities get into storage and other opportunities, we'll see more producers that could bring down price because of value in different measures than currently witnessed. We have quite a bit of ability there. And as far as R&D, the U.S. Department of Energy is really focused on that, everything from storage and compression technologies and improving those to new novel approaches to this. And so it's everything from things we can do in the very near term to long-term R&D. And I think you'll find in the coming months, we're going to see more and more analysis on specifics where those costs can be reduced. So another question, Andrew, was from your analysis through all this reporting, how important have you found the infrastructure development to be to the vehicle deployment?
It's fundamentally important. You know, we could only get to an early commercial launch with stations. And to be quite honest, the auto manufacturers actually brought commercial vehicles out earlier than even was expected in the 2012 or expected or projected in the 2012 California Fuel Cell Partnership Roadmap, which really looked at 64 stations kind of being when they could introduce the vehicles. And we are right now at 64 funded, 35 open, and even when we had 6 stations or 8 stations, we were starting to get to some commercial introduction by some of the auto manufacturers. So it really does speak to we need those stations. And as I had also mentioned, we're seeing through our joint agency staff report, which comes out every December, that we're increasing the network capacity. But even though we're growing the total capacity, we're actually growing average network utilization, and we're growing, and we have increasing numbers of stations every quarter that are utilizing more and more of their hydrogen capacity or dispensing more and more of their hydrogen capacity. So that really speaks to the fact that, yeah, the network's growing, but the vehicles are actually growing faster. So it's something that, you know, really, I think, shows the evidence there.
Good. And there's a question here on if you have refill time statistics from real retail stations, and maybe I'll broaden it a little bit and ask, you know, with that in mind and other statistics that you might be collecting or along with CEC along the way.
So ARB does not collect that data. However, through the solicitations, there's a requirement for all of the station operators for the first 3 years at least to actually report quite a bit of data to the National Renewable Energy Laboratories NFC Tech, which I'm going to forget at the moment what the full acronym is. But it is essentially a clean room kind of data storage where NREL scientists and engineers are able to actually evaluate and perform statistical analyses on these same types of topics you're talking about. They look at performance issues, they look at price, they look at maintenance schedules and all that kind of stuff. I do not off the top of my head happen to know what their number, if they do have such a one on the actual, I do think they do have fuel refill times, but I don't know off the top of my head. I would encourage anybody who is interested to Google NFC Tech NREL, and you'll probably find the page where they have all their public information for that.
Great. So I'm looking at our time. We have just under 10 minutes. There's a number of questions up here. I think maybe I'll throw you a couple more, and then up to you if you want to go through more questions or if you think it'd be more valuable to hit some other highlights.
Let's hit a couple questions.
Okay. Here's a fun one. Let me do the other states. Is there any coordination with neighboring states such as Oregon to promote hydrogen fueling beyond California?
So I'll say at the moment there is no formal program. I will say that several agencies within California that are involved in ZEV deployment actually were constant contact with other states, constantly talking to them, understanding, trying to answer their questions. To be honest, you know, hydrogen in the United States is being pioneered in California. We're learning a lot of the hard lessons, a lot of the early lessons, and we're trying to do the best that we can to convey those to other states that might be interested who are looking at it and saying, okay, oh wait, that actually does make sense for us too. How can we get started in this? So state of California, we also realize that if this remains a California only thing, it's not going to be successful, and we need this to be successful. So we are, across several agencies trying to do everything we can whenever we're asked to help inform the other states.
Yeah, and I think, I'm not sure how much you might have mentioned earlier, Toyota and Air Liquide building some stations in the Northeast, and as you said, state agencies are looking how to help expand, not just in the Northeast, but the neighboring states where drivers have asked for years to be able to go. So it's, I would say from the partnerships perspective, as the success of the initial market is starting to take root, we're in a better position to look beyond the borders and figure out how to help. So a couple on the heavy duty here, and one question, I'm going to put a few together. One is, isn't hydrogen and fuel cells better suited for Class 8 vehicles? And then how does deploying the light duty side of hydrogen infrastructure and fuel cell vehicles help the development of the heavy duty side?
So, well, I'll first say that yes, hydrogen fuel cells are very good for heavier vehicles. That's one of the strengths of the technology. However, I would not say that they are necessarily only better for Class 8 vehicles versus light-duty vehicles. I think they're equally adept at both types of platforms. What we're seeing now is actually, for those who may not be aware, Toyota has developed a truck. I think they're on their second prototype version of it. This is a Class 8 heavy-duty truck that goes from the Port of Long Beach up and down the 710. And for anybody who's familiar with the area, you know how much of a nightmare that is, and makes deliveries. And the technology powering that truck are fuel cell technology directly from the Toyota Mirai, the light-duty vehicle that they released. So we are actually, there's been speculation in the past about, yeah, there should be a way to have some crossover, some benefits from the light duty, and we're actually seeing that now. We're seeing it in action. I think that's really exciting. In terms of the infrastructure, we're learning a lot on the infrastructure side for light duty about all the things you need to prepare and all the things you need to think about. The lessons learned, permitting, standards, codes, operating procedures, all that good stuff. And that's only going to be, more helpful even on the heavy duty side when we're trying to get these vehicles out there. I will say, and I think this is conveyed in the resolution document, similar to what I was saying about how the light duty fuel cell stacks are being incorporated into heavy duty. It looks like because of the number of light duty vehicles you might get economies of scale more likely on the fuel cell side through the light duty market. But in terms of the hydrogen, the heavy duty and medium duty market is going to consume so much more hydrogen per vehicle than light duty vehicles, and much more predictably. And so the economies of scale on hydrogen production, distribution, logistics, that opportunity may exist on the heavy duty side, but then spill over to light duty in the same way that the fuel cell is spilling over onto heavy duty. So,
yeah, and that quickly gets to some of the cost questions as far as raised earlier.
I think we'll just go with more questions now. Yeah.
All right, then I'm going to ask a fun, challenging one, but I'll go for it. A question here on what are the other OEMs when are the other OEMs getting projected into the game? And going with that, let me find the right question here. Instead of pursuing two technology options, why might a manufacturer not just choose one and go with it?
So I'm not sure I can actually answer the first question in terms of when would other vehicle manufacturers be getting into this. We have to keep some aspects of the survey confidential, so that we are not revealing individual companies' business plans that they are very kindly telling us through this survey. I will say that probably the best source for that is somebody like the California Fuel Cell Partnership or the auto manufacturers themselves, in terms of their plans. I do understand the transportation future is quickly changing all the time. So plans are also changing all the time. And so I would encourage anybody who thinks it's set to not really follow that mindset. The other is if you're two forms of technology, why would anybody go with two? As I had mentioned earlier on, just for the full market-wide, there's so many different types of needs you need to meet for vehicles, for light-duty vehicles. People who own their vehicles, they own them for different purposes and for different uses. And an auto manufacturer wants to capture as much of the market as they possibly can. So if battery vehicles are going to capture some portion and be really good for X% of the market, and fuel cell vehicles for Y%, as long as that auto manufacturer has the resources and the funds and expertise and know-how to pursue both, I don't see why you wouldn't.
Yeah, thanks for letting me ask that. I know it's a interesting question to ask, and I'll add my 2 cents, which is, as you said, automakers want to sell as many cars as they can. So on one hand, they would sell every technology they could, but it is a big investment up front, and we're still developing both markets. So they're having to make choices. And what you'll find is sometimes they'll lean harder in one direction or the other, different manufacturers, depending on their typical customer base. But at the same time, you'll find, we see it in the codes and standards world especially, there isn't a manufacturer out there that isn't working both angles, even if it's not so public. And to that first question of what they release and publicly acknowledge, I have no special information on anything, but those are those trade secrets that keep them competitive, and we don't get that detail. So we do know that, around 2020, and we've heard a lot of predictions, or at least some public comments of much more in the hydrogen space, and I know we'll continue to see more battery models come around. So it's one that I knew it was not an easy question, and we may not have all the answers, but didn't want to hide from it. All right. Let's see what else we hear or we see. Besides hydrogen station infrastructure capacity increases, what is the major hurdle to be cleared technically? And I assume that's in the infrastructure side. How do you see?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we hear often is essentially costs of operations because of the cost to compress and chill, to compress up to 700 bar and chill down to minus 40 degrees. I think finding technologies that are more efficient at that, or operation modes even that are more efficient at that, it could be a technical hurdle. There are also things that I guess would not be game changers, but are definitely significant, I would say, annoyances. So things like nozzle freeze lock is something that is not very, good for the customer. It's probably something that can be, it's just an engineering question, but we don't yet have a product on the market, right? That totally, or we haven't seen a lot of products on the market, I should say. I shouldn't say we don't have one, but yeah, I think those kinds of technical, there are some smaller technical questions that just don't help with the sense of the retail fueling aspect.
Yeah, that's good. Can you explain how LCFS will help the deployment of the hydrogen infrastructure? You had some points there earlier.
Yeah, so first I'll clarify, there's two real aspects to this. The first is that hydrogen, sales of hydrogen actually can generate LCFS credits through the traditional LCFS credit system, and those who generate those sales or generate those credits can sell those credits to people, to essentially fossil fuel manufacturers who have deficits within the program. And so that can be a revenue stream based on throughput at the station. However, there's also proposed changes to the regulation right now in response to the executive order that allows station operators to actually also gain or generate credits based on the difference between the throughput and the capacity. So essentially they have an assured total credit generation of the total capacity of the station for to be determined amount of time as the regulation is finalized, so it's a regulation language. So what that does is that it provides the station operators, granted there is still some uncertainty because the price of a credit within the LCFS program does fluctuate, but it's been pretty stable in the last couple of years, and it's actually been rising. So there's some uncertainty there, but it does provide them a pretty certain stream of income for the early years of their operation, which could actually be the most difficult years, the years when there's not as many vehicles as perhaps the station is ultimately built to fuel. So if we can incentivize getting the right number of stations at the right capacity for the future by helping them get through an early low utilization period, then that can help get more, well, the idea is that can help get more stations out there. We have to see because we haven't implemented it yet.
And it'll encourage the private investment behind those. A related question there, and I don't know the answer offhand, but if the existing stations will be eligible for those credits.
Yeah, I will say do not quote me on this because the LCFS staff who are developing the regulation language are obviously the most qualified to answer it, but I believe so.
Good. Let's see. I think we've gone through most of them. There are more questions, and I will reiterate that we will answer those offline. But I also see we are at the top of the hour, a little past, and I want to respect everyone's time. So I want to say thank you and for Andrew for all of this and sharing with us. And then I think any other administrative items is we will post all of these. You'll be able to find the presentation and the questions online, but I'll let Andrew with any closing remarks you might have.
Yeah, just want to quickly put up, in case anybody does need my email address, it's on this slide. But also I do want to mention that when we post the presentation, I will provide the presentation with the material I did not get to, but I also do, of course, encourage anybody who is really interested in understanding the CVRP analysis or understanding the analysis process behind 1 million stations or 1 million vehicles and 1,000 stations and where those stations go, to take a look at this presentation and the report itself, and of course any other major points that we discussed today.
Great.
Thank you all for your time.